The REDUCE-IT trial randomized over 8,000 patients with hypertriglyceridemia to either icosapent ethyl 4 grams a day or placebo. Patients had to have triglycerides greater than or equal to 135 and less than 500 while on statin therapy with well-controlled LDL cholesterol. Patients additionally had to have cardiovascular risk, meaning either secondary prevention type patients, those with stable coronary artery disease or cerebrovascular disease or peripheral artery disease, or primary prevention patients, specifically those with diabetes and at least one additional cardiovascular risk factor. So these patients were randomized to one of these two arms and followed for an average of about 5 years. The primary endpoint of the REDUCE-IT trial was so-called 5-point MACE, or major adverse cardiovascular events, meaning cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, stroke, hospitalization for unstable angina, or revascularization. This was significantly reduced in the overall trial, about a 25% relative risk reduction that was highly statistically significant. As well, the key secondary endpoint of cardiovascular death, MI, stroke, so-called hard MACE, was also significantly reduced by about 26%. We've done additional analyses of the data looking not just at time to first event, the conventional way of doing such analyses, but instead also looking at total events, that is the sum of initial events and recurrent events, and have found a 30% reduction in total events, which from a patient's perspective, of course, that's how they look at things. Patients care about having second events, that is, they'd rather not have a stroke after an MI or a cardiovascular death after an episode of unstable angina. So from a patient-centered perspective, perhaps the total events is really the more appropriate way of looking at data, though the conventional historic way is time to first event, but really any way you slice the data, significant reductions both in relative and absolute terms in important ischemic events. We've also examined a number of different subgroups. Most recently, patients were examined by their baseline tertile of triglyceride levels, and what we found, not that the trial was designed or powered for subgroup analyses, such trials never are, but we did find significant reductions in ischemic events in all three tertiles, including the lowest tertile of baseline triglycerides, and that included patients with triglycerides as low as 100, even though the inclusion criteria, as stated, was really 150, but we allowed variation in triglycerides, and indeed there was even greater variation when we looked at an average of a couple of measurements, as is known to be the case with triglycerides. So bottom line is we got patients with triglycerides as low as 100, but even those in that range of 100 to 150 or so seemed to derive substantial benefit from icosapent ethyl versus placebo, arguing, at least indirectly, that some of the benefit might be beyond just triglyceride reduction.